When Amir Rao, founder of Supergiant Games, began development of Transistor, he wanted player experimentation to be at the center of its design. Rao hoped to solve a problem that he felt plagued similar games. Oftentimes, players would use the same strategies over and over and over again to resolve every single conflict. In fact, many RPGs and other similar games give players little reason to radically switch up playstyles halfway through the game, either because it is not cost-effective or there aren't that many options to explore in the first place. Amir Rao hoped to discourage players from sitting on the same small group of abilities throughout the entire game. So how did he do it? Well, today on Design Deliberation, we're going to pry open the function system to figure out how Transistor encourages players to branch out and explore the full extent of the game's systems. The first and arguably most important thing a game needs to encourage players to fully explore game systems is, well, deep systems. If a player doesn't have many choices available to tackle an encounter, then the player is not going to be able to explore those systems very deeply. Transistor does this phenomenally well. Transistor is an action RPG. The game allows the player to equip 4 abilities to their active slots, which lets the player use these abilities in an encounter. However, Transistor is not your typical action RPG. Instead of running around frantically dodging attacks while trying to land their own, the player has the ability to pause time, where they can carefully plan out future actions. However, the player only has so many action points, and every action the player takes will use different amounts of their action points depending on the strength of the action being used. This is where the heart of Transistor's combat system lies. It moves the game away from twitchy reflexes and reaction time to being almost more of a puzzle game, where the player has as much time as they want to search for optimal solutions. If the game ran at full speed, it would be nearly impossible for the player to pull off some of the things they can do with the pre-planned action system. Lining up 2 or 3 enemies for a piercing attack, or getting behind an enemy to backstab them for increased damage would be much harder to do at full speed. Because the player has complete control over their attacks, these moves are very common to use in Transistor. Of course, the player is not in control forever. After using their act phase, the player is unable to use any of their other abilities, unless they have a very specific function equipped, and are helpless to the attacks of enemies. Transistor's combat swings back and forth between moments where the player has complete control over their situation and moments where the player has no control. Since the act system allows the player more control over their actions, Amir was able to create a series of 16 unique abilities that are each designed to combo with the other abilities. The first function the player receives is Crash, which does not do a massive amount of damage on its own, but it makes the enemies take more damage in future attacks. Or Jaunt, which allows the player to cover more distance in less time, allowing for better positioning. Each function embodies a very specific kind of attack, such as long-range attacks, area attacks, healing, leeching, debuffs, and so forth. But if this was all that the function system did, I probably wouldn't be here making a video about it. Strap in, folks. This is where things get crazy. You see, the player has 4 active slots for abilities that can be used in combat. However, that does not mean that your other functions have no use. In addition to their active slots, players also have passive slots, and most importantly, upgrade slots, each of which allows you to equip more of your functions. Let's start by talking about the upgrade slots. At level 1, you'll have 4 upgrade slots, 1 for every active slot, and they will modify the effect of the function that you've equipped in your active slot. For instance, upgrading Breach, a long-range spear attack, with Get, an attack that brings enemies closer to you, will result in a long-range spear attack that will draw enemies closer to you so you can hit them with your shorter range attacks. Since every function can be combined with every other function, the players are given the tools that they need to experiment, and it gets the gears turning in the player's head thinking about all the possible ways the functions could be combined. I haven't even mentioned the passive abilities, which change your stats or give you special effects like deflector shields or illusionary copies of yourself to distract enemies. As with the upgrade abilities, the passive abilities further expand the depth of the game. However, a deep set of abilities does not make an explorative game on their own, as the player will just find a set of abilities they like and use them for the entire game. So how does Amir encourage the player to explore the game to its fullest? One thing that Amir mentions is that Transistor lacks a sense of investment that is common with many RPGs. For example, Supergiant's first game, Bastion, has a progression system which allows the player to invest money to upgrade weapons they like. This is not necessarily a bad thing. However, progression systems can tend to tie a player to one specific playstyle, or make further exploration unfeasible, partially because of how our brain works. Psychologists have found that once someone has put some sort of investment into something, such as time or money, people will be driven to get as much as they can out of that investment, even if doing so is not advantageous in the long run. Usually, this comes up in business, where companies will not kill a project that they have already sunk time and effort into, even if cutting their losses and moving on will save them more time and money in the long run. This is called sunk cost fallacy. While sunk cost fallacy is usually discussed in business terms, I think it also manifests itself in video games, progression systems. When a player spends time or money leveling up a piece of gear, they have become invested in it, and are unlikely to spend time experimenting with other items, because, hey, I spent good money on this gun, it'd be a shame if I never got to use it. Am I saying that all progression systems are bad? Of course not. However, I am saying that if not designed carefully, players might get attached to specific sets of items and abilities, and therefore not be encouraged to explore the full depth of the game's systems. Transistor's progression system, however, avoids this because the player is a lot less likely to get invested in specific functions. Yes, the player does level up and receive a function as a reward, however, they cannot improve the power of their functions they currently have. The crash function will be just as powerful at the start of the game as it is at the end of the game. Since the player doesn't need to spend anything upgrading their functions, they are much less likely to get invested into a single function. Transistor also helps players try out new function through the game's health and respawn system. If a player dies during an encounter, that does not mean that they've lost the fight. Instead of respawning at the last checkpoint, like in most games, the player is given another chance to continue the fight. However, they lose access to their most valuable function, not only for the current fight, but for a couple more after that. In the meantime, the player will have to use some of their other functions while they wait. While this approach is a bit heavy-handed, it certainly does have some advantages. Firstly, it gives death serious, long-lasting consequences that will force a player to think very carefully about their actions. In most games, death is not a huge setback, as you'll just be sent back to the last checkpoint, and the player is back in the action in no time. This works well for most games, especially games where repeated practice and hyper-precise control are very important. But this is really turning into a bit of a tangent that might be better addressed in a video of its own. Just know that because the player is struck with strict consequences, they're going to be a lot more careful with their actions. The loss of functions also forces the player to experiment with new functions that they might not have used otherwise. The loss of a function the player has relied upon for the whole game and forcing a player to use functions they might not have fully explored might in fact be a blessing in disguise. Players might discover new uses or gain a new appreciation of abilities, and they might even change their play style to use a function, even if they have access to the functions that they lost before. Of course, this is only one side of the exploration coin, the stick, which is a common term used to describe a punishment for undesirable behavior. The other side, of course, would be the carrot, which is a reward for desirable behavior, which can also be an effective tool for controlling player behavior. Transistor also has some carrots in store for people who take the time to explore the full extent of the functions. Every function is associated with one of the citizens of the cloud bank. However, the player doesn't receive any information about them unless they use the function. Each data entry is split into 3 sections: an introduction to the person in question, some sort of conflict, and a final entry which concludes their story, usually ending with their disappearance from society. These posts are very interesting and give some insight into the world of Transistor, and the first 2 entries end with a minor cliffhanger, which leaves the player ready to figure out what happens next. So how are these data entries acquired? By exploring the game's systems. When a player uses a function in an encounter, they will reveal a new section in the lore files. However, in order to reveal all 3 of the lore segments, you need to use the function in your active, upgrade, and passive slots. This means that if a player wants to see the full story of a function, they will need to use it for at least 3 encounters, with the functions and abilities being fully explored over the course of those 3 encounters. This system encourages players who might normally stick to only a couple of abilities, branch out and explore the functions because they're intrigued by the mysteries of the cloud bank. Transistor also takes a break from its main gameplay to do short challenges, each of which test a specific skill, such as speed or efficiency. Unlike the rest of the game, players can only use specific functions for these puzzles. These puzzles are often designed to showcase specific uses for the functions, but they also introduce the player to new combinations of functions that they might not have thought of yet. Once introduced to some of the tricks in the puzzles, players might try these out in the main gameplay, perhaps combine it with another function to put their own spin on it. So everything I've mentioned so far is about how Transistor encourages basic exploration of the game's systems. But what about players who really want to dive deep into Transistor systems? Well, it turns out that the game has higher level players covered as well, through the use of limiters. As the game progresses, the player unlocks limiters, which makes the player weaker in exchange for getting more XP at the end of fights. The limiters act as a difficulty setting that the players do not choose at the start of a game, similar to how Dark Souls handles difficulty. These limiters are completely optional, but if a player feels that a game is a bit too easy, they can crank up the difficulty as much as they would like, in a way that makes the player feel more skillful and clever. You see, the limiters, for the most part, don't just increase the enemy's stats. Instead, they change a lot of the fundamental mechanics of the game. For instance, one of the limiters spawns more cells when enemies die, which a player needs to collect before they turn into enemies. Another function gives these cells shields that must be broken before they can be collected. When a player equips a limiter, they notice a rise in difficulty much more than if they had just selected a difficulty setting at the start of the game that gave the enemies more health, because the player can see the very distinct differences in difficulty before and after they equip the limiter, and they're much more satisfied when they overcome these self-imposed obstacles. This also helps the player find a difficulty setting that is best for them. When the player first boots up a game and is presented with difficulty choices, they often have no idea how challenging each of these difficulty levels actually are. Is the hard mode slightly more difficult, or is it nearly impossible? Same goes for easy mode. This leads to instances where many players who might have been able to handle the higher difficulties end up playing a normal mode, or players who might struggle through the normal mode but might have just had a fun romp through the easy mode. Because the difficulty is integrated naturally into the Transistor's systems, The player can decide how much they can handle and will organically find the difficulty setting that is right for them. Hopefully, by using these or other similar design tricks, developers can make games that nudge players into embracing a playstyle that is more interesting and exploratory. It certainly worked well for Transistor, and I'm excited to see more games encourage their players to get the most out of their systems. I hope you have enjoyed this deep dive into Transistor's functions. However, this video came out a lot later than I would have liked. I had to deal with some technical issues, and then I got sick, so if I sound a bit weird and nasally, that's why. Hopefully the next video will not take this long to come out. Either way, this has been Chariot Rider. Have a good day.